Hello, everyone. I'm Bill Raggio. I'm a senior fellow at Foundation for Defense of Democracies and editor of FDD's Long War Journal. This is Generation Jihad, the podcast that covers all things in what used to be known as the global war on terror, but we now call the Long War. Welcome back to the program, everyone. We've been doing a lot of these episodes, and we're going to continue to do so. This conflict between Israel and Hamas continues, as well as the potential broadening of the conflict. Today, we have a special guest, Sinan Ciddi. He's a non-resident senior fellow at Foundation for Defense of Democracies and an expert on Turkish domestic politics and foreign policy. Also, of course, we're joined by Joe Truzman. Sinan and Joe are my friend and colleagues at FDD. Joe is an analyst here at FDD's Long War Journal, and he primarily focuses on Palestinian terror groups and Hezbollah. And he's been closely covering this war. Strongly recommend you follow Joe on Twitter at Joe Truzman. He's helping keeping me up to date on what's happening in the conflict. Very valuable. Sinan is on, so today we are going to talk Turkey. But before we get to that, let's quickly check in with Joe on the latest news on the conflict. Last evening, we had a U.S. launch 2 airstrikes against Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which, of course, is Iran's special operations branch. We hit 2 weapons storage depots in Syria, and this is in response to Shia militia attacks against U.S. forces. There's been 19 attacks, I believe they said since the beginning of the war, but in the last 10 days. This is a phenomenal number. Also, yesterday, we had a limited ground incursion by the Israel Defense Forces into Gaza. It looks like they're preparing the battlefield. Joe, what else is happening in the area before we get into it with Sinan? Just give us a quick status update on the fighting and is this conflict expanding in the north? Tell us what we need to know, Joe.
Yeah. Hey, happy to be here again, as always. So, a couple things overnight. As you mentioned, the Israelis went into Gaza as far as, I guess on the coast there. I think it was in the north. I can't remember correctly. In the northern Gaza, that is. And then this naval unit, or I think it's referred to as Shayatet 13. So there was a limited incursion, we can call it. Now, of course, Hamas tried to spin that. They said that this Shayatet 13 contingent or grouping of special forces soldiers, Israeli special forces soldiers, left a bunch of weapons, and they had to retreat, and that the Air Force, it was the Israeli Air Force that saved them. So they were just spinning it, making it seem like it was Hamas that repelled this attempt by Israel. But there's a lot of propaganda going on, so I'd take that with a grain of salt. So anyway, the Israelis did take out a mid-level commander overnight or yesterday. I did mention, actually, when was it? Wednesday, we talked about, I said there was something. I guess I said something big happened that day, but we weren't sure what it was. So it wasn't until the day after we found out that a Hamas commander, one that actually was involved in planning the October 7th terrorist attack in Israel, he was taken out by the Israelis. So I wouldn't say he was a super high level guy, but at the same time, he was important, right? So because he was one of the people that planned the attack. So he was an important person. So that's what I was referring to on our podcast on Wednesday. So they did take somebody out. So thankfully I was right on that. So, but anyway, and then in the north, right? So Hezbollah continues to the losses continue to grow. All right, they're sending guided missile teams, mortar teams, rocket teams to hit IDF targets, but the closer they get to the border, they open themselves up to Israeli surveillance, the drones, and they get hit. So right now, we're looking at about between 40 and 50 Hezbollah members killed in action. So that's for 3 weeks of fighting, that's a lot for Hezbollah, but it's just a limit. I mean, Hezbollah is huge, so it's just a limited amount, to be quite honest. So I don't know if it's really going to hurt them, but still,
it's a reasonable estimate on the size of Hezbollah's military force.
I've
heard anywhere from 50,000. I hear 100,000. Do you have a beat on that?
No, I think Hassan Nasrallah said like about 100,000 or probably even more than that. So it's honestly just like rockets. I think it's their arsenal. It's just an estimation. So definitely in the tens of thousands, probably in that 50,000 range, probably higher than that actually. So, but I couldn't really tell you a number as far as, a definitive one, right? So, and I don't like guessing on things. So it's a lot though. So 50 or 40 to 50 really isn't a ton. And I haven't seen actual commanders like the ones that are very important to the group being taken out. All right. At least that from Hezbollah's statements, they haven't said it. So I think these are like the foot soldiers that are being taken out. So again, I don't think it's a huge blow to Hezbollah, but still it's a decent amount of people getting being eliminated by the IDF. So and interestingly, right before this, and I'll wrap up, the IDF just said that rockets from Lebanon, I'm assuming they're fired by Hezbollah, landed in Syria, not in Israel. So essentially, Lebanon, one can argue Lebanon attacked Syria today. So it's kind of interesting. But anyway, that, and then there was a drone strike in Egypt, actually near Eilat, which is in Israel. So, but this happened in a neighboring town, but in Egyptian territory, and it looks like it was the Houthis. Don't know what happened. I don't know if this drone was taken out and it crashed, or Houthis just hit the wrong target because it was so close to an Israeli city, but in Egyptian territory. So I don't know. So that's interesting. So it seems like the Houthis are still trying, right? But then when we say the Houthis, I mean Iran is still trying to attack Israel on a different front. So
it sounds like what you're saying is the Iranians are really basically trying to spur on a wider regional conflict, even trying to draw in the United States. Am I reading this right?
Yeah, no, of course. I mean, we were seeing it. I mean, Bill mentioned it earlier, just with the strikes in Syria, the American response to the Iranian-backed militias targeting U.S. bases in the region, especially the ones in Syria. So absolutely, this isn't all just a coincidence. I'm sorry. So the answer is yes. So this is what worries me more than anything. I mean, the Gaza-Israel thing is important. Don't get me wrong, but I'm very concerned about this regional war spark blowing up here essentially. So and then on different fronts, we're seeing Egypt being attacked. All right, come on, and the Egyptians could respond to it, right? I mean, technically they have the right to. So that's what I'm concerned about more than anything, this regional war. And I think the Americans understand that, the Israelis understand that, and everybody else understands that. So, and I think Iran is definitely pushing for that rather.
Yeah, and if anything, it seems, to me that these militias, the Houthis, certainly can do much, much more. The Iraqi and Syrian militias can certainly be hitting the U.S. and the Israelis harder. I think what we're seeing is a sort of a form of patience. The Iranians are doing just enough at this point in time to turn up the heat, but not to cause the pot boil over. But I suspect once the Israeli ground invasion kicks off into northern Gaza, that heat may be turned up, and we may see that lid blow off the pot. That again is my concern as well. And then you have Turkey, who is becoming a belligerent in this conflict. We'll get into that more. Let's do that. Let's turn back to Turkey right now. And in 2 days, Turkey is going to celebrate its centennial. Its president, Erdogan, has been in power for 9 years. He's been president of Turkey for 9 years. Previously, he served as prime minister of Turkey for 11 years. So he's been at the top level of power for over 22 years now. He has been arguably the most influential, I don't even think it's arguable, influential politician in Turkey. And he is weighing in on the side of Hamas. On October 25th, he described Hamas as, quote, a liberation group. He's not calling Hamas a terrorist organization.
No, a group of mujahideen.
Yeah, is that how he put it?
That's an exact quote. A group of mujahideen trying to defend themselves.
Yes. And he canceled his planned trip to Israel. The Israelis, of course, are furious at this, as well they should, given the horrific attack they suffered at the hands of Hamas. So, Sinan, is Erdogan and Turkey's support for Hamas, does this for show? Is it just skin deep, or is it real? And if it is real, how deep does it go? What are Erdogan's motivations for supporting Hamas as he does?
I mean, I hate to toot our own horn at this, but look, FDD has been spot on this for not just the last sort of few days, weeks, or whatever, but basically since 2011, when it basically first came onto our radar, right, suggesting that Turkey was essentially going to be providing an institutional sort of mechanism for Hamas to exist outside of Gaza, inside of Turkey, right? It's not just, a tangential sort of bypassing relationship. Hamas's ability to do what it is, right, in coordination with Iran, is in no small feat due to its direct relationship and operating base out of Turkey. And to Joe's and Melissa's, two of our colleagues here, Joe's here, Melissa's not, ongoing work on this, which we hope to sort of highlight more. They've been basically mapping out Hamas's organizational network inside of Turkey that covers individuals, members of parliament, companies, persons who have directly, and not even clandestinely for the most part, sort of directly enabled and sort of, shone up Hamas's, institutional existence in Turkey. In fact, the U.S. Treasury just sanctioned more entities, which Joe and his team had been basically warning about, saying and highlighted by name and company association, saying these guys are bankrolling and fundraising for Hamas, right? So this has been really going on since 2011, when there was an initial prisoner exchange, allowing for one Israeli soldier to be released by Hamas in return for 10 Hamas militants that then were essentially given residence inside of Turkey. And there, from then on in, there were reports suggesting that the Turkish government transferred somewhere in the region of $300 million to Hamas inside of Turkey that allowed them to get a base, right? And since then, what we've seen is Hamas has basically established up a shop, offices, which the government has granted. They've been given Turkish passports. And when we say Turkish passports, let's be clear, they were given to one of the likely masterminds, or two of the likely masterminds of the 10/7 attacks, Ismail Haniya and Salih al-Aruri, right? And if your listeners were paying attention, Ismail Haniya was reportedly, based on Al Monitor's reporting, he was basically supposed to be in Turkey on the morning of the attacks, right? And soon as these started happening, apparently the Turkish government said, quote, that he should leave politely. He was politely asked to leave Turkey, end quote. So this isn't just a sort of tangential relationship. And to your further question, Bill, is this surface deep, or is it Erdogan pragmatic, trying to sort of hedge between this? Not at all. Look, if anything, Erdogan has been swimming against the grain since 2022, when they've been supposedly trying to rebuild, ties with Israel, which he wrecked with the Mavi Marmara incident back in 2009, right? And that's why he was supposed to sort of shake hands with Netanyahu, whom he hates, and the feelings mutual on the other side. He hosted the Israeli president Isaac Herzog, back last year. So none of that was moving anywhere, because the big elephant in the room in terms of rebuilding ties between Turkey and Hamas was essentially, well, Israel says we can't really have a relationship until you outlaw and disestablish Hamas, and they're not willing to do that, right? And the fact that now he's really come out and sort of all guns blazing for Hamas, and we're about to get a full spectacle of this tomorrow. Right. If your listeners are interested in this, in a sort of pro-Hamas sort of pep rally watching, they can tune in to basically any media outlet in Turkey. There is something called a Great Palestine meeting in Istanbul's main airport, the one that was closed and a couple of years ago, where Erdogan's going to be headlining this meeting. So it's going to be pretty vile, full of anti-Semitic, anti-Israeli slurs, we're guessing, right? So none of this is sort of unintentional, and Erdogan is really coming out of this. And we should also mention that FDD research showed that this summer gone, Israeli customs authorities seized close to 16 tons of raw material, which apparently is directly used in the making of rocket explosives. And that was seized from a ship that was bound from Turkey to the Gaza Strip. What we don't know is if the Turkish government was directly involved in this, or they were turning a blind eye, and I have no faith in this, whether they just didn't know about it, right? How do you surreptitiously move 16 tons of explosive materials with nobody paying attention? We can talk about Turkish public opinion on this, right? I mean, I was looking at this, and historically, before Erdogan, Turkish public opinion, I would say, was not overly complimentary towards Israelis or, Jews in general. But let's be clear, Mustafa Kemal's republic, right, established strong protections for not just, non-Muslims in general, but the Jewish minority in Turkey was Turkey's largest sizable minority. Jews have existed in Turkey since they were shoved out of the Iberian and Spanish Peninsula, right? When sort of Turks or Islamists close to Erdogan's party line, shout out these anti-Israeli or anti-Semitic slurs. Let's be clear: when they tell these people to go home, Jews in Turkey have existed in Turkey for over 600 years. So, when they say go home, those people have existed, and that is their homeland as far as they're concerned. They are primarily Turkish citizens. They're proud of their Jewish heritage. And to the extent that AKP has tried to vilify them, shame on them, simply because, it must be doubly awful living in Turkey, being a Jew, but also witness Erdogan's daily diatribe of grotesque remarks against Israel and the Jewish faith and culture in general, simply because who's there to defend them? I'll stop there briefly because I could just go on forever.
No, that's great. Sinan, really, he's telling them to go home. Where would that be? Would it be Israel? Isn't Erdogan saying the?
I know. I mean, he hasn't said that, but it's his followers who just like
Okay.
I saw we saw a sign up on a bookshop in a pretty conservative district of Istanbul yesterday, which kind of went viral, saying Jews not allowed into this bookstore. I mean, I was just absolutely flabbergasted. It's not that the Kemalists or the pro-secular party is innocent of sort of anti-Jewish position historically, not at all. But the Jews overwhelmingly in Turkey vote, quite strongly for the Kemalist party, the party of Ataturk that established Turkey, right? Simply because they feel that party is the best guarantor of their rights as citizens in Turkey. And let's be clear, Jews in Turkey are the backbone of the middle class, the backbone of the industrial sort of job-creating class that has built Turkey to the economy that it is today. Some of the biggest industrialist families account for a significant portion of Turkey's GDP generation. To sort of vilify this faith and this culture in general, but also at home, by putting up signs saying Jews not welcome, is not only reminiscent of the 1930s in Germany, but also it's just fundamentally unacceptable. Now, most level-headed Turks agree with this position, saying that it's grotesque. But the rank and file of AKP supporters are being radicalized, right? That needle is being turned in favor because Erdogan has made no attempt to prevent, for example, attacks upon the Israeli sort of diplomatic compound. So if you saw like Foreign 10-7 attacks, the Israeli consulate in Istanbul was surrounded by a mob firing fireworks at the embassy. And I did not see any attempt by law enforcement, who are charged with protecting foreign missions, to sort of prevent this. I haven't seen Erdogan basically saying anything in the realm of, we are saddened by the events of what happened on 10/7. We condemn this massacre. None of that. It's basically just saying, Hamas is a mujahideen group, that the Israelis are killing babies. It's the usual Erdogan that we know. So it's not like, if Erdogan wanted to act strategically in this environment, you would have hoped, but sort of like, at the very least, trying to toe the Qatari line in terms of not going full Hamas. At least putting a veneer of, let's be calm and collected about this. We want to mediate. Of course, we're saddened what's happened. But, by them, make references to a wider sort of political problem that exists in the background of this conflict. None of that at all. He's just basically gone straight out of the barn gate, right? Saying whatever. And that's going to ruin ties between the United States and Turkey, and the pressure upon Turkey to by Turkey's Western allies is going to increase. We're seeing, important movers of this already. What we're seeing is already, Joe just mentioned some entities that are being sanctioned in the last few hours or a couple of days. Those are going to increase. The more entities in Turkey that are openly Hamas, those will be sanctioned likely. There was a letter that was sent out by the office of Congressman Papas, co-sponsored by Bilirakis, a bipartisan letter sent by the House of Representatives, approximately 50 people close to, sent that letter to Secretary Anthony Blinken saying, demanding that Turkey's relationship with Hamas be basically terminated on all levels. Basically suggests asking that all material support, and I don't use that term lightly, for Hamas should be terminated. And our colleagues at FDD Action were instrumental in helping to draft that letter. So we're very proud, essentially, in making sure that gets out of the barn gates, because and that level of pressure is likely to increase as this conflict continues to escalate.
Yeah, let me reiterate, your kudos to Joe and Melissa and the team at FDD that have been working these issues long before people knew that these were issues. It is interesting at times like these when, your work sort of culminates and you get to see the effect. It also really does suck when you find out you were right? You're sitting there in the background explaining Turkey's a problem, its relationship with Hamas, it's becoming authoritarian. These things, and then this war breaks out and you see, and it's all there. It's all there to see. But
it's embarrassing. I mean, so I'll tell you straight up. I mean, some of my Turkish colleagues and friends have reached out to me personally saying, you should be ashamed of yourself. You're shilling for American interests or Israeli interests. What's wrong with you? And my hit back is, and they're basically saying I'm, under the influence of Zionist CIA-backed FDD payroll. And I'm like, okay, guys, do you know how embarrassing this is for me as a person who originates from Turkey? I wake up like you mentioned at the beginning, this Sunday is Turkey's centenary as a republic. Do you know how embarrassing this is? That where I was born and grew up, a country which I love, right, is basically protecting a known terrorist entity that was amped on Captagons before they assassinated, Israeli citizens who just basically had woken up or going about their daily business. That my country's government supports one of the vilest terrorist entities in the entire world, and at the same time, whilst criticizing Israel for supposedly engaging in counterterrorism operations, the Turkish military has been engaged in conducting over 500 military strikes in northeast Syria, killing Kurds, targeting hospitals, civilian infrastructure, and nobody's paying attention to this because Erdogan is not wasting the opportunity of a crisis to get in the way of him murdering our Kurdish partners who, on a daily basis, fight ISIS. Let's just be clear. This is hugely embarrassing for me. I am ashamed. That's not the country I was born into or grew up in, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's a difficult position to be in. I was in a similar situation with the fall of Afghanistan, right? Having to be critical of the U.S. military, of the U.S. government, watching President Biden denounce Afghans, saying they weren't willing to fight when they died by the tens of thousands over the years, and were actively fighting against the Taliban as we withdrew. It really is. It just makes you question why you do what you do at times like these. Joe, can you give us a little flavor on some of the recent sanctions? I know that they're probably not household names for people here in the United States, but what efforts are being done by the U.S. government to push sanctions to help? I mean, look, I'm always skeptical of the sanctions game. I think they're important for us to identify problems and nodes and to take action against them. But the reality is like regimes tend to just ignore them. And, I don't think Turkey's just going to turn around tomorrow because we sanctioned some businesses and individuals. But tell us and stop its support for Hamas. But it is important to identify these and put that out there so that U.S. businesses don't get tied up into it. But yeah, tell us a little bit about some of the sanctions that have been put down.
Yeah. So, and Sinan mentioned this, and but part of my work, and I don't actually talk about a lot, is networking Hamas, or rather identifying Hamas networks in other countries. Okay, so in this one specifically, it's been Turkey. And even in more detail, their illicit financial transactions that they do in Turkey. So Hamas's involvement in Turkey is definitely not skin deep. This is very legit. It's turned, essentially, the way I see it is that it's turned Turkey into a hub for financial transactions and military operations. Okay, so the way I see it is that Hamas makes money to bankroll its terrorism in Turkey. Yes, they do it in other countries as well. Don't get me wrong. This is just a Turkey thing. So, but it's big in Turkey. So some of the people that have been sanctioned, some of the entities, individuals, in the last few weeks, one was, a few of them been today, and a couple of them were, I think it was last week or the week before, that were sanctioned by Treasury, were people that I'm familiar with and that I've looked into, and that the evidence is there that they've been that they're involved in financing terrorism, especially for Hamas. So it's very pleasing to see them being sanctioned and designated, because they absolutely deserve it. And the very important thing is that some of these individuals, they're in other countries as well. They're doing this in other countries. And on top of that, there are other individuals that are connected to them that are doing the same thing in Turkey and in other countries. So this is just the tip of the iceberg as far as Hamas's network, a financial network. Okay, so they're getting some, which is very good news. The Treasury is designating some, but from the analysis that we've done at FDD, we've done a really thorough job of it. So regardless, it's just the tip of the iceberg there as far as Hamas's financial schemes in these countries. So I think that's important to note.
Can I just ask you a question, just to get your view on this? Because you've been doing this for a while, and it's really interesting work. I mean, FDD's been spot on. Like, we've actually come up with individuals. We have amazing diagrams and mapping that you guys have produced. Why is it taking just the October 7th massacre for the U.S. officials to take an increasing sort of focus? Oh, let's go and sanction some more people. I mean, these were, the U.S. targeted, designated Hamas a terrorist organization. So, Qatar, Turkey, and other sort of foreign bases. Why has it taken 10/7 to move on these individuals? Or am I just, misrepresenting or misframing the sort of the scene here?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. So in a perfect world, they'd be sanctioned, designated, whatever, immediately, right? But it just doesn't work that way, at least in my experience. All right, I'm just talking about me, what I've been through. So what have I experienced? So it takes something big like 10/7 to get the how should I describe it? The wheels turning for let's say Treasury to go after individuals. So yeah, I wish it would be faster, but it should be quicker, because there are other groups as well, or entities that I think, oh, definitely should go after these guys. Or like there's Palestinian armed groups like the Popular Resistance Committees that have a long track record of terrorism, attacking Americans, by the way, and participating in this October 7th attack, that have not been designated as a foreign terrorist organization, even though I believe the criteria is there. The designation, or the criteria to meet designation is there, but it isn't. So I'm hoping that this will happen, at least with this group and other entities. But yeah, that's just not the way things work, unfortunately. Something big has to happen to get the attention of the authorities to get these designations placed. Yeah.
It seems on one level we're just upset about, we're afraid of, the United States is afraid of upsetting, a bunch of individuals that we could have sanctioned, like the ones that came out this morning that you and I noted. I mean, who are we afraid of upsetting if we designate and sanction some of these nasty people and the companies that they own? I mean, it just befuddles me. I'm not necessarily looking for an answer at this point on this, but it is bewildering that we weren't able to act on this, with more guts before this. Not that it would have prevented this thing, or maybe it could have dealt a higher blow, but it just seems incredulous that we just waited until a massive tragedy.
So the designation process, it just doesn't happen overnight. These groups are being investigated. They're building a legal case, because with the U.S. designations, they want these to be rock solid. So they're very meticulous, and they want to bring them to particularly European governments so that they will also sanction these individuals. So the reality is the individuals who are sanctioned today, that work began very likely years ago. But what you had both alluded to here is that it takes something big in order to push it over the finish line, basically, right? And I've seen this numerous times with designations of multiple jihadist groups. They nearly always happen after some type of big event, which makes them, I think it actually weakens the designation process. It makes it look like, oh, all of a sudden the U.S. reflexively designated this individual or that individual because of some type of attack and it's a retaliation, when in reality, these things have been researched, have been worked on. They should be pushed out. It shouldn't take an October 7th or a Mumbai, or, pick your major terrorist attack over, the period of the last 2 decades to push a sanctions designation over the finish line.
Look, these are bad people and bad entities. You should have done this before, and it's not a moment of I told you so, but can you please take this stuff seriously? Right? Connections are abound. As Joe was talking, another sort of, look, Turkey's not just Hamas, but look at the Iranian back sort of connection to this too. Back sometime earlier this year, I believe it's February, Treasury officials sanctioned a Turkish national in Turkey by the name of Sıtkı Ayan. And we wrote about this and we publicized it. This guy is 1 degree removed from Erdogan personally, right? And this guy was sanctioned for, again, breaching US sanctions on Iran, for selling oil and gas on behalf of the Iranians, right? And allowing those proceeds, basically, of that sale to essentially be put into the coffers of the IRGC. I'm not making this stuff up. This is a US Treasury sanctioned official that's directly related to Erdogan. They went to school together. They grew up together. In fact, several years ago, he basically worked for Erdogan to mask the identity of an oil tanker, which was worth basically $25 million, right? And basically the accusation stands that he masked the identity of that. And the proceeds from the sales of that oil were suspected to be going to the Erdogan family, right? This stuff that we write about is not just sort of gobbledygook that we just make up. We take the lead, we investigate, we work with officials from Treasury, and sometimes essentially those sanctions end up working. The Ayan story, we basically assumed, was at that time intended as a warning shot across the bow by the US government to Turkey, saying, hey, if you're still breaching sanctions against Iran that were reimposed after 2018, please don't go the way of the Halkbank and think that, we helped bust back in whenever, several years before that. But I would not be surprised if Turkey is still doing this, and helping out the IRGC, right? So we have to be, we have to dust this stuff off, and we will continue challenging this work to officials in the hope that they will take it seriously and act upon it. It's not that hard.
Yeah, I concur. A quick question this is for both of you, gentlemen. Where do you put Turkey in the hierarchy of the supporters for Hamas? Is it number one? Is it number two? I would say the major supporters being Iran, Qatar, Turkey. Who am I missing here? Malaysia. Yeah. So where would you rank Turkey in that hierarchy? Would it be number one? Would it be number two? Would it be number?
I'll go first real quick, and then by all means, Sinan, you can add to it. But yeah, I think Iran is number one, of course, and it's just because of the support, all the money they send. But then Turkey, I think, is too. Just, you could maybe say Doha or Qatar as well, but I think Turkey, just because of the amount of money that Hamas makes in Turkey, and the support it gets through Turkey, and the military activity it has there, or the hub that it has for military activity, especially for attacks or operations that are directed from Turkey to the West Bank, right? Because there's Hamas. Obviously, Hamas is in the West Bank. So I would put it right up there, probably 2 or 3, but yeah, right behind Iran. But of course, Sinan, I'd love to hear your opinion.
Oh, see, the hierarchy, I'm not confident to weigh in on in terms of, the work you guys do in terms of sort of just building those connections. I'm not intelligent enough with the material, the data to suggest where Turkey ranks in this. But I would just back you up by saying, look, it's clear the reason why FDD has a Turkey program since the early 2010s is because it's come to our attention, or my colleagues' attention, way before I started there, that Turkey is increasingly becoming an enabler of not just Hamas, but also other radical Islamist entities in the region. If you just look at its role in Syria, it is still backing al-Qaeda-affiliated extremist organizations such as Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, not to mention some other odious groups, right? And And that is hampering our ability to ensure that ISIS doesn't basically flare up again. So I don't know about ranking, but it's clear Turkey's really established itself as a household name in backing extremist organizations in the region. And that's, again, for me, that's embarrassing. I'm not proud. I don't sort of say, see, I got you. I mean, it hurts, right? That is not the country that I originated in. And that's sad.
Sinan, I'm very familiar with that sentiment that you have now that I think about it. I'm good friends with Hussein Haqqani. He's Pakistan's former ambassador to the U.S. He can't go back to Pakistan, right? He'll be thrown in prison. And he talks about Pakistan's relationship with terrorist organizations, with the Taliban, other groups. And you could hear that pain in his voice, right? He's a patriot. He loves his country. He can never go home. And he has to sit there and go on the radio and write and print because he does it not because he's being paid as a shill by the CIA or whoever else, but because it's not the direction he wants to see his country go. And I asked that question specifically because I've seen with, it always seems like all roads lead back to Afghanistan with me, but there's parallels, right? Pakistan clearly was the number one supporter of the Taliban, but one of the things we were able to prove in a court of law is that Iran was a significant supporter of both the Taliban and Al Qaeda, safe haven, money, training, all weapons, all forms of aid. And once I got through the case and looked at this, I said, look, I always had to talk to the lawyers that were working on this. I said, look, Pakistan, when I began it, right, I thought Pakistan clearly is number one and, kind of looked at the Iranian support as a little bit of a sideshow, but it became, over time, it dawned on me, this Iranian support was significant. And that's what I'm getting with Turkey's continual support. It's like, it seems to be building to a point where it's not just chipping in with a little bit of aid, but it's a considerable support node for groups like Hamas. And it's a worrying development because Turkey is a member of NATO.
Right, it's getting into trouble. See, that's the problem. So if you say, well, given all this that we've just put out there, why is the US government or NATO itself really sort of still putting up with this? That's a really good question. And I do know at least our colleague, John Shanzer, has basically been on the airwaves recently saying, well, at least we should have the conversation of what it takes to sort of hold a member inside of NATO accountable for acting against NATO's interests. Should a part of that discussion be in terms of tossing out members? I don't know. It might be a worthwhile conversation having because NATO was created to essentially thwart a Soviet enemy. It was never created with a mechanism to answer what do you do with an insider threat. That's a problem. But to the extent that the US is dithering on this, it's not because it doesn't know what to do. It is worried about burning bridges in terms of, well, look, if we just hold it to account along the lines that we're suggesting at FDD, then what would happen with Turkey's cooperation against the Russians to the limited extent that it exists, right? Such as, they helped with grain shipment deal, they sold them a bunch of drones, et cetera, et cetera. They still close off the Black Sea to Russian warships in the Mediterranean. Right. I mean, I don't necessarily say I agree with that because I think for every sort of, small thing that they do right, as in the bare minimum, what it takes to be an ally, such as maybe approve Swedish accession into NATO, we are sort of bombarded with a barrage of stuff that they shouldn't do. Right. And at this point that, the tipping point seems to have been surpassed. But, officials in various administrations and have been sort of reticent to actually just sort of, be increasingly more punitive against Turkey.
Yeah, I mean, look, allies should have shared values, right? We should be able to recognize what a terrorist organization is. And if Turkey can't look at what Hamas did on October 7th and reevaluate what the definition of terrorism is and what Hamas is as an organization, as you noted, and improperly, we have to question its commitment on, the main issue that it's the main reason why it's in NATO, right, was to thwart Soviet aggression. Now, obviously, to maintain an alliance for the European countries. But yeah, it's a real puzzle. And the last thing the U.S. and Europe wants is the shrinking of NATO with the growing Russian problem with Russia's war in Ukraine. So these are real dilemmas for the U.S., for NATO countries. I'm going to have two quick questions and then we'll wrap this up. Sinan, you mentioned that there's he basically described a slide towards anti-Semitism in Turkey. Is Erdogan and his AKP party, are they aware of the implications of what they're doing? Are they acting reflexively here? Do they, what is, I can't understand the motivations for this, it's hard to believe that they can't see the impact of what they're doing here, as you noted, but the potential destroying of a significant portion of the middle class that props up Turkish industry and Turkish business. I mean, aside from the actual, right, the moral dimension of this, there's a sort of a self-destructive aspect of this.
I mean, it's hard to answer. I agree with you, Bill. It's a longer conversation, but one of the things that I've been looking at over the last, just pondering in the back of my mind, it's a good question. Motivation. Why does he do this? Knowing full well. Look, some part and parcel of this has to be about Erdogan's legacy. Right. I mean, he's 70, close to 70, going on 90. Right. I mean, he's tired. He's been in power for 21 years. He's pissed off that he hasn't been able to outdo the reputation of Ataturk, which he has been essentially trying to, supplant in the Turkish mindset. He said back in 2018, when he was elected a president for the second time, right, that the AKP and his government, they've succeeded in every sort of ambition as in leaving their mark for Turkey in a very consequential manner, except in the realm of culture and education. Right. Translation: that means essentially really remaking the image of Turkey in a less Kemalist, less Ataturkian, if you want to call it that, much more sort of conservative, Islamically rooted. He often talked about the creation of a pious youth to sort of regenerate Turkey in the 21st century. That hasn't taken root. I mean, over half the country hates this guy. But on the one level, I think that destructive thing that you mentioned is he's just digging in. This is how he is hardwired. He is an Islamist through and through. If you look at the sort of trajectory of how Erdogan was politically socialized and raised in a movement, he was raised in Turkey's most anti-systemic political movement. The political Islam movement in Turkey that he grew up in is just hateful and remorseful of the country that Ataturk built. He tried to essentially sort of play by the rules for the first part of his tenure in power in the early 2000s, right? And then he's basically thought, well, I can do whatever I want, because if I grew the country economically, then I can shape the culture of Turkey, the country politically and socially too. That hasn't worked. And even, instead of backtracking on that and say, well, let me actually take Turkey to where it deserves to be in the Western fold, I'm just going to continue digging in, even if that means that's going to be the end of the Republic as a secular, as a publicly accountable entity, which has a large social contract and buy-in from its people. He doesn't care.
That gets back to the first question that we discussed, right? Is this skin deep, or is he a true believer?
He's a true believer. He'll die trying, right?
Yeah.
He often says, we came into the business with our kafan, our burial shroud, as in he's ready to die for the cause of whatever that means. Sure. I'm willing to bet he won't backtrack from being an authoritarian guy that just tries to sort of subdue his people until he dies. But one thing is for sure is I don't see him, he's not going to leave power peacefully.
And final question here, and I'll start with you, Joe. Is Turkey and Israel over the last couple of years have been working to restore the relationship. After all of this, do you think this is irreconcilable? I realize we're looking into the future here. There's a lot that's going to go on in between. Do you think that this relationship is irreconcilable at this point?
Unless Turkey takes concrete steps against Hamas, which I highly doubt they will, just due to the history and current rhetoric that Erdogan has been saying. I doubt they're going to recover from this anytime soon. Anyway, I mean, it seemed like in the last couple of years that the relationship between Turkey and Israel was coming to mending. Right? It was nice to see. Herzog came to spoke with Erdogan and met Erdogan rather. So but no, I just don't see it. Just because if Israel has declared war on Hamas, and Hamas needs to eradicate Hamas. All right, that's what they've declared after October 7th. So, if another country like Turkey is harboring Hamas, members of Hamas, especially its leadership, very important people, then I just don't see Israel again mending ties, right, with Turkey. So I just don't see it happening anytime soon, unless Turkey takes those steps first, which I doubt they'll do.
Right, Sinan, which he just laid out, right? I mean, Erdogan's a believer. How do we expect him to just turn on Hamas? But go ahead, your view, Sinan.
I mean, just re-echo that. I think that, and Turkey could make a move against Hamas if Erdogan is out of the picture. But that's, the underlining point is if Turkey was an institutional government, right, where, Turkey's foreign ministry, Turkey's sort of establishment, sort of government agencies in the so-called good old days, even if it was a flawed democracy, right? I cannot imagine or envision a scenario in which Turkey would have ever established that or established Hamas as an entity inside of Turkey. To the extent that, they are pulling the weight for Erdogan's sort of position on this, I don't necessarily feel they feel comfortable, right? So, take what, Turkey's ambassador to Washington, right, who's been here for several years. He's basically been going around trying to sort of soft pedal a message from Erdogan, a more placatory image of Turkey. He's been going around sort of visiting pro-Jewish American organizations, trying to say, look, we stand with you, not in this current crisis, but just previously, right? Like at a time in last year when Turkey was trying to rebuild ties with Israel. And then following, the 10/7 attacks, what you see is Erdogan going out blasting Israel, saying, that its behavior is bordering, quote, genocidal actions, end quote, right? And what's the ambassador to do with that? And when people ask him about, well, how do you square Erdogan's personal remarks with what you were trying to do for the past year in terms of, help rebuild ties between major Jewish organizations in America and Turkey? He looks at it and probably just says, hey, it's complicated. It's an unsellable message. If Erdogan's out of the picture, I think Turkey's hand becomes a little easier. But, and Erdogan in leadership just constrains everything.
Gentlemen, thanks for your insights today. Joe, thanks as always. Great to have you on Generation Jihad. We've got to get you back on soon.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah, man. Thanks, everyone, for joining us for today's episode of Generation Jihad. Just a reminder, you can find us on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you listen to podcasts. Make sure you subscribe and leave us a review, preferably a positive one, but only if we earned it. Thanks again. We'll see you all again soon.